My name is Heather Miller-Rubens, and I'm the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And it is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Zeyneb Zelegan, who is our new Muslim scholar at ICJS. She joined the staff this summer and relocated her family to Maryland in the midst of the pandemic, and we're incredibly grateful that she was able to do all of that while sort of managing the moment that we're all living through. I also hope that you all are safe and well and able to be okay in this moment. I know it's trying in different ways for different people, and just know that we're very much keeping you all close to heart and mind at this moment. I'm going to talk briefly about the format for today's event. So I'll do a formal introduction to Dr. Sayilgan, and then I will have a conversation with her for about 30 minutes. The chat will be open for the entire time that we're talking. And then we'll leave the sort of second half hour of our conversation to answer questions from the audience that you may have for Zeyneb. And so again, if you want to participate in the kind of Q&A portion, put your questions in the chat, and we will do that at the end of our time together today. So Dr. Zeyneb Zelegan was previously the Henry Luce Visiting Assistant Professor of Islamic Theology and Religious Pluralism at Virginia Theological Seminary. Prior to that, she taught at Catholic University of America and at Georgetown University, where she also served as a residential chaplain for students from all backgrounds. She earned her doctorate in theological and religious studies from Georgetown University with a focus on Islam and Christianity. She has a Master's of Arts in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations from Hartford Seminary, and a Master's and Bachelor's of Arts in Islamic Studies and Law from Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. A native of Germany, Zeyneb was born to Kurdish immigrants from Turkey. Her personal experience with religious diversity and Muslim immigration informs her academic work, with a research focus on the intersections of religion and immigration, particularly in relationship to Muslims living in the West. She is currently working on a book entitled Islam and Immigration, Theological Insights from the Quran, with Baylor University Press. She is also the co-editor of the companion to Syed Nursi Studies and Faithful Neighbors, Christian and Muslim Visions and Practice. And we are delighted that she has joined the staff of ICJS and can't wait for you all to get to know her. So welcome to Zeyneb.
Thank you, Heather, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who zoomed in and on this beautiful afternoon. I'm excited to see some Hartford Seminary friends. Yeheskel, hi. And so it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. I'm looking forward to meeting you all in person soon, hopefully when it's safer.
So we want to begin today's conversation by asking you, Zeyneb, about how you came to interreligious work.
Sure, I'd be happy to share. As you just shared in my bio, I was born and raised in Germany, and which is a country that I love in so many ways and admire in so many ways. But it's also a country that, just like here, wrestles with its cultural and religious diversity. There are currently around 5 million Muslims living in Germany, and religion is not really a public affair. You live. I mean, it's a private affair, and people don't really perceive religion to be something to be lived out in public. So, growing up as a Muslim, and as a teenager, when I started to pray 5 times a day, or observe the fast of Ramadan, or decided to wear a headscarf, I became very visible as a Muslim, and people started to ask questions. And as a teenager, I don't really welcome these questions because I just wanted to fit in and blend in and just belong. So I was always confronted with very uncomfortable questions and negative stereotypes related to Islam. And there were a lot of statements where I didn't see myself. That was, I think, the most painful part, that I couldn't recognize in any of these statements or depictions the beauty of Islam that I had encountered in my own life. And so gradually I came to embrace the interreligious enterprise. I was forced to face these questions, and they made me actually become more self-aware and self-conscious. Why am I a Muslim? I was forced to ask that question and really go deep and be more critical. Am I a Muslim just, because I'm imitating my parents based on imitation, or am I really basing my faith on conviction, certainty, and knowledge? So in the process, I came to embrace interreligious engagement. I gradually lived into that. It's not something that I made a conscious decision. It became an intrinsic part of my life. And as I was wrestling with these questions, I also saw that it was a privilege to have that position and experiencing different cultures and different communities. I came from a very traditional Muslim family, but I also lived in the secular realm. So where there was always the conversation between the secular and the religious, but also Muslims and non-Muslims. And so I decided then after high school that I wanted to become a journalist and reach a larger audience and help people to get rid of their stereotypes and help them to understand each other. And so that's actually how I came to do interreligious dialogue. And while I was working at newspapers and radio stations, I became more interested in the academic field of the study of religion. And so I ended up becoming also an academic vocation.
I want to build off of the last comment that you made about your sort of move from it sounds like a kind of personal journey that moved into advocacy and education through journalism, and then you sort of shifted into an academic focus. Could you talk a little bit more about what research areas you're interested in and why you wanted to sort of pursue an academic focus as opposed to sort of a popular or journalistic focus?
Right. I mean, so much what I do is really, in a way, embodied pedagogy. Like, I really lived these questions. I was confronted with them. And so, again, as you stated in the beginning, I was a child of Kurdish Muslims who immigrated from Turkey to Germany. And again, so I was growing up witnessing my parents' pain and other immigrants, Muslim immigrants, as they wrestled with questions around belonging and identity and the notion of home and territory, border, and this public debate around integration and assimilation. So there's a lot of stress and trauma and pain. And I also was somebody who loved German language, loved German culture, embraced the beauty of both. I saw myself cultivating a hybrid identity. And so, people always in Germany forced you to make a decision. Either you love being a Turkish Muslim or Kurdish Muslim or a German Muslim. You can't have loyal or dual loyalties. And so slowly, where I found my strongest refuge was really in faith, in my own faith tradition, which empowered me and comforted me and liberated me and also helped me to embrace all of these identities. I realized I don't belong in one box or one category that is, constructed. And so when I started my doctoral program, I began reading about this new emerging field about migration theology or immigration theology. And I became really interested in looking at this whole set of questions from a theological perspective. How do we make sense from, in the context of scripture when we look at identity and home and territory and language and, assimilation? So I was really interested and started reading the works of primarily Catholic theologians who were theologically reflecting about immigration here in the United States. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. I really want to do that from a Muslim perspective and really, uplift or lift up the voices of immigrants, Muslim immigrants, so that they also become active participants of the conversation and not just objects. And especially in the West or in Germany, immigration or immigrants are always outside of that public debate, and other people talk about them. And so really my focus, what really became my focus right now is the intersection between religion and immigration. There's a lot about immigration from a sociological perspective, from a political perspective or approach. And while I do interdisciplinary work, I'm really interested in the spiritual and the theological aspect of it, because many immigrants are in their immigration journey empowered by their faith resources, and it's not as utilized. People always think, or at least in Germany, there was this understanding that religion is an obstacle to integration, whereas there are many studies that actually show that Muslim immigrants who actively in their congregations participate, they're empowered and they learn a lot of skills. So religion is really a powerful force for good in that regard. So I'm really interested in this whole area of theology and immigration.
That is fascinating. We're excited about the book that you're working on also on this regard. A follow-up question that just sort of struck me while you were talking is the kind of role and the importance of language in the process of immigration and theological thinking, but also in the interreligious space, that the words that we use to describe one another or to try to understand each other's faiths can often be a site of both opportunity and learning, but also kind of confusion and misrepresentation. It seems like there's also in your story kind of an attraction to words, right? Even from your journalism entry point to a scholarly pursuit. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about how language plays into your thinking about your scholarly research, but also the interreligious project.
I think words are so important, because especially when it comes to terminology, when I say word of God or prophet, we have different concepts behind these words. So language is definitely a critical factor. And I think there are also sometimes, how do I phrase that? So I think to be cognizant of how when we use these words, these terms, how does the religious other interpret them, to be really mindful of that and conscious of that. And when I think of the Quran, that this is, or interreligious engagement, that interpretation is an endless effort. It's not one final meaning, but because religion and their followers are so complex, there's always endless meanings about scripture. So for example, the modern phenomenon of fundamentalism or extremism is a reaction to modernity. Whereas if you look at the history of Quranic exegesis, you see there's a healthy dialogue and healthy disagreement, where people really, the scholars, understand this can never be the final word on this, because God's word is eternal. There's always much more to be said about this. And to understand that complexity, I think, is critical. And sometimes people, these extreme voices want you to push in one direction and say, what is the final meaning? And to push back and say, well, there are 6 billion people around the world, and there is much more complexity to that.
What attracted you to working at the ICJS?
I think, again, there's so many things that I'm passionate about that ICJS offers. Community building, research, and teaching. I have the opportunity and privilege to get to do all the things that I love and I'm passionate about. I think at many institutions, or I have the sense that when you're an academic, then community building or being a community activist is not so easy to accommodate. But as CJS, I feel like we can live into this three-dimensional reality of community building and teaching and research. And I also think that the Institute really makes a clear point that religious differences are not a threat, but a rich resource for us, for our social fabric, and that these religious differences are highlighted and people want to talk about them. I'm sure you have said it many times, we tend to focus sometimes just to being polite or at the very beginning of the dialogue conversation. We want to stress the commonalities. And while I think that's important, we also need to talk about the religious differences. And for me, I think ICJS is a place where I can just truly be. You know, what makes me unique as a Muslim is also that I live my faith differently, that I have, you know, that there are certain differences, and not many institutions are willing to accommodate that or allow for that. And so I just have the feeling that I can just be a whole person, genuine, authentic, and that I don't have to hide myself in any way, and can be a Muslim, a devout Muslim, but also a critical scholar. I think there's sometimes, frankly, this assumption that you can't be both, that, you know, these are mutually exclusive. And I don't, you know, subscribe to that kind of understanding.
So can you speak a little bit more about your hopes for the ICJS and your, both personally as the Muslim scholar, but also for the organization? I know you've come to us from a seminary context, which is just also a wonderful asset for us, to that you were just deeply involved in seminary education for several years. And you also are coming to us with a chaplaincy background from your residential work at Georgetown. And I'm wondering if you can kind of weave together your academic focus and that sort of sensibility about religious formation that you sort of nicely spoke to, and chaplaincy work, community work.
Yes. I think you just put it so beautifully. I think it brings all the things together that I, you know, try to, you know, where I try to diversify my experience, or try to, you know, holistically bring together. So chaplaincy work was for me important because I, you know, in terms of community building, being closer to the community, to people on the ground, and bringing the questions in the academy to the community. And my hope is really, it might sound cliche maybe, or too nostalgic, but first and foremost to really be at service in helping Muslims and others to build strong friendships and strong alliances, and to really embrace one another's difference. I want my two little girls to grow up with people of other faith and no faith, and while rooted being in their own faith tradition, and to help everyone see that this is can be an organic part of our lives. So my priority has been always relationships, and I try to always implement that in my own life. And one of the best memories I had when I you know, we host these regular interfaith potlucks, and I remember one Christian friend saying, "You have such wonderful Muslim friends. I've never met a Muslim." And that just warmed my heart, because I wanted him to see and to experience the beauty of Islam, not because I wanted to evangelize, you know, but that's the experience that I've grown up with. And I don't think that many people have that opportunity. And in terms for ICJS, I really pray and hope that its vision is embraced by many societies, Muslim and Christian and other religious societies and communities, and that it becomes a norm, and that we can expand our work into all the areas where interreligious encounters are naturally happening, like in hospitals, at schools, university campuses, where we have a very eager young population who wants to learn about different faith traditions, and they're really yearning for spirituality and wanting to learn from another, and go into these areas, and, you know, workplaces. So these are the places where I encountered interreligious questions. And sometimes they create tension, but I think if you really proactively engage them, you know, we can avoid these conflicts, and we can empower people to see them as a rich resource.
one thing I want to lift up from what you said, I think at our best as an organization is that we do value this kind of idea of the scholar practitioner, that there's a way to be, critical and engaged with the thinking of our traditions while also being believers in our traditions. And so we can sort of toggle back and forth to that kind of critical analytical mode, but also the kind of spiritually grounded mode.
Right.
I'm just so glad that you're joining us in that effort and bringing that sensibility even more to the fore. I was wondering if you could actually share with our audience today a sacred text that inspires you and tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I didn't want to share the obvious ones and I didn't say that earlier, but I think there's a theological and moral imperative for Muslims to share their story and share their narrative, because the Quran itself as scripture, as divine scripture, is very dialogical, constantly talking to Jewish communities, Christian communities, to people who don't embrace faith. And we're very open. And so there are a lot of passages that speak to that reality. But there's one that's really powerful to me, is in one of the later chapters of the Quran, it's chapter 81. There's this beautiful description of Judgment Day. I mean, it sounds really frightening because on one hand, you have all these like cosmic changes and shifts. So the Quran mentions that, the stars will move, and then the sun and the mountains, Judgment Day, there are all these like kind of frightening changes. And then there's this like radical shift to this little baby girl who is asked on Judgment Day why she was killed. And for me, it's just so beautiful how in scripture you have on the one hand the cosmos, and then there's this move where you have this baby girl. And some of you may be familiar that in pre-Islamic times, baby girls, there was female infanticide, so baby girls were killed alive. But on Judgment Day, she will be asked for what sin she was killed. And that, I think for me as a Muslim, it's powerful because it calls me to pay attention to those who are marginalized, to those who are voiceless, to those who are oppressed. And with this baby girl, I mean, she's pure, she is innocent. She was seen as invaluable, worthless. But it's God who will ask her directly, and she will have a voice. And I think for me as a believer, it's an invitation to be very, very mindful and cautious about the voices of the oppressed, to bring them in, to be mindful of those who are silenced, and that all of them who have been silenced, that God will hold me accountable, and that they are as important as all these cosmic shifts and all these things that we consider as enormous in the universe. So I think as believers, as practitioners of interreligious dialogue, you need to be mindful who is not at the table, who is being silenced, especially in this very painful moment in our country, and I think around the world. There are a lot of people who feel like they're excluded. And I come from a minority perspective. I'm very sensitive to all minority issues because I have experienced discrimination and stereotypes. It was very painful to me myself. So I'm always like very keen in trying to see, or making an effort at least, that those who are marginalized come into the center and have a voice. And I think in interreligious dialogue, sometimes people don't feel they are included. And I think that's a powerful message for me here.
For everyone who's joining us now, I dropped the passage that you were referencing into the chat, so you can see it. I don't know, Zeyneb, if you can peek at the chat briefly and maybe read it aloud for folks.
So it's in the Quran, chapter 81. So at one of the later chapters, and it's verse 1 to 14. It's longer, but I shortened it. So again, in the beginning, you have all these like cosmic shifts on Judgment Day, when the sun is wrapped in darkness, and when the stars fall dispersing, and when the mountains are removed, and when full-term she-camels are neglected, and when the wild beasts are gathered, and when the seas are filled with flame, and when the souls are paired, and when the baby girl who was buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed. And a soul will then know what it has brought with it. So each of us has this idea or notion of individual accountability, and that we need to, or call the heat to pay attention to those who are, perceived to be at the margins, who are voiceless. And again, the sad reality is that, I mean, here it speaks about women and, girls. They struggle all over the world, and so do other, people who are, minorities, or who are, labeled with certain labels. And I think for us, wherever we are, in which country or context, there's always the dynamic of a majority oppressing a minority. If I go to Turkey, there are these dynamics. If I live in Germany, there are these dynamics, right? So again, I think here it's beautiful how God says, everything is recorded, and He will, ask the ones who were oppressed why that was the case. And so I think for me, it's this very powerful reminder of how I need to conduct myself in this whole work that I'm doing.
Thank you for sharing the passage and its meaning to you. I'm curious as to take a step back from the particular and to think back on your teaching experience in both university context and seminary context, but also interreligious context. When you're presenting the Quran to interreligious audiences or folks who have not read it before, what are some things that you offer as guidance to entering into the study of Quranic text and conversation?
Yeah, I think I would be hesitant to give anybody just the Quran, like a plain translation. I mean, you could do that, but I think right now we have, for example, the Study Quran, which came out a few years ago, which is a nice work done by Muslim scholars, but also who are respected scholars in the academy, in the Western Academy of Quranic Studies. And the Study Quran, for example, does a nice job. And there are, of course, it's not a perfect work, but I think it's a good starting point to see the wealth of Quranic exegesis, that the Quranic scripture has not one meaning of one passage, but that the meaning is in flux. It's never settled, to use a migratory term. It's always moving depending on the context. And every Quranic scholar who has approached it always was mindful of that the Quran leaves room and is flexible enough to leave room for multiple interpretations, and that all interpretations are limited in a way. And so there's never a final word. And that scriptural exegesis, again, is a work of healthy dialogue and healthy disagreement. And you see that in this really groundbreaking work. You have Sunni and Shia commentaries, and just to show you and provide you with a spectrum of thoughts, that Muslims have always wrestled and reasoned with the Quranic text. It was never like a monolithic or static enterprise. And I think that's really key. And one thing I always tell students in the classroom: contextualize the Quran. And any religion has never lived in a vacuum. There are always geographical, linguistic, historical, political, socioeconomic factors that you need to take into consideration. There are 2 billion Muslims around the world. Yes, they share definitely certain beliefs and practices and values, but there's a lot of variety. They speak different languages, they come from different cultures, each of them has a unique relationship with the West. So there's a lot of nuance and complexity, and oftentimes we always have this very one-dimensional, one-sided perception about Islam and Muslims. We think they are all uniform, they all act the same, think the same, dress the same, which is not the case. And also, just like from a human perspective, that to respect and understand that every Muslim is on their own faith journey, struggles, wrestles with these things, and goes through their own spiritual evolution. The Zeyneb that I was when I was 18 doesn't exist anymore, because I went through, hopefully, a positive transformation, right? And so to just keep that spectrum of Muslim experiences in mind is really, really critical and to be cautious about the one-sided media representation, and to be a critical consumer of that. I'm not saying that these depictions are necessarily untrue, but they're one-sided. There's much more nuance and variety and diversity in the Muslim world.
Oh, that's a lovely way to close, I think, our portion of the conversation today. And I want to turn to the audience now and encourage everyone to participate with questions and answers in the chat feature. And thank the amazing staff of ICJS for helping Zeyneb and I to kind of get your questions and synthesize them and put them in some order, but really just encourage you all to participate in the chat so you can bring your personal questions to Zeyneb. I will look, I'm just taking a quick assessment as to what's coming in here. I think I have one question to start with. Again, it kind of goes back to your personal experience. Could you talk and perhaps compare your experience of being a hijabi woman in Germany and being a hijabi woman in the United States?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. People have asked me that before. I mean, I haven't lived in all parts of the United States. It's a very large country, but I've been here for 15 years now. And my own experience in the United States, being a very, again, visible Muslim woman, has been throughout only positive. I've been always respected for who I am and always treated with dignity, and I've never experienced any negative things, nothing. I mean, I can say in these 15 years. And actually, when sometimes Muslims complain about the United States, and I know there are challenges here, there's also Islamophobia, I have to go, my frame of reference is Germany. And again, I love this country, but I think was for me personally much harder to be a Muslim woman there. I mean, it still really saddens me that I had to leave Germany because I didn't get a job. I'm an accomplished woman. I graduated from university, but it was very hard for me to find a job in the academic world because people would see me with my hijab and then would say, no, we can't offer you a job. You're either not neutral enough or you're not modern enough. And I think sometimes in that regard, I understand the Muslim youth in Europe. They feel disenfranchised and frustrated. There's always this notion of self-expression and freedom of, who you are. But in my own experience, I didn't see it. I mean, I didn't feel that was the case because I always constantly got the message that you only are welcome if you look like us and act like us and believe like us. And that was one of the reasons why I left Germany, because I didn't have the opportunity to contribute to mainstream society. And many Muslim women struggle still to this day. I mean, I started in 1998 with this kind of active interreligious work, and still things have not changed. We still talk about the same issues. I might sound a little bit bitter, but it's just the reality. And it really pains me to see that. I don't want my two daughters grow up in such a world where they still have to defend themselves or explain themselves to others why they believe in a certain way or they dress in a certain way. And that's what I'm trying to work actively. I try to channel my frustration in constructive ways, because I think I need to tell my story. I need to challenge these kind of notions. But to go back to the initial question, my experience here in the United States, it's, at least in the Northeast, I think, and in this region, has been only positive. And when I have relatives or friends coming over, they actually say, that they feel Americans, especially here in this area, are very, very, very respectful towards people of other faith. And so they feel the same way.
One other question coming from the audience has to do with your research into Syed Nursi, and maybe you could talk a little bit more for those who are on the call who don't know who Syed Nursi is, but also talk about whether there are some synergies between ICJS's mission and sort of Nursi's thinking.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Oh yes, absolutely. I think that, I mean, Syed Nursi, just for those who are new about hearing him, he was a Muslim theologian who lived a very long life, experienced World War I and World War II. He was a theologian in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey actually. He came from where my parents came, from the Kurdish East, so that's also a connection that I share. But he's someone who has, who went through all these kind of very drastic changes. He witnessed, again, you know, these world wars. He witnessed, experienced the rise of secularism, the rise of modernity, the whole notion and struggles around science and industrialization. For me as a young Muslim, when I was first introduced to him in Germany in 1998, in the 90s, he's somebody who really informed my own theology and spirituality in many ways, who shaped it, because much of his writings really deal with questions of faith and modernity, and really beautifully you know, wrestles with these kind of questions about what it means to be a believer in the modern time, and to be open and to engage questions that you know, people ask who don't embrace faith and who really want to challenge you. And he's very confident in his faith. He really encourages the reader to face those questions. And I found him very empowering as a young person. And I love his piety also, his devotion, his groundedness, and how he writes about God and modernity and the world and science and all the questions that, you know, the notion of egotism and aggressive individualism in our time. So he has a lot to offer, I think. And he actually, it was in the very early, even before Nostra Aetate, where he talked and even went to Pope Pius in Istanbul at that time to start and initiate Christian-Muslim engagement. I didn't use that word dialogue. I think it was in the 1950s, if I remember the correct date, but you can look it up. And for me, that was very powerful. I mean, he came from the Muslim majority, but he said that Christians and Muslims need to create an alliance and need to put their differences a little bit to the side and work for the greater good, and really address the common challenges. And I thought that was amazing, you know, that somebody, a major Muslim scholar, initiated such a conversation, reached out to Christians much earlier. And so these are the things that we don't know about him. And in the back, I have all these red books. These are actually his writings. And so I encourage you to learn more about him. And I think he's a fascinating thinker.
I want to ask my own follow-up question here. I will take the moderator's prerogative for a moment. One of the things that you mentioned, and it links back to sort of an earlier part of our conversation, which is about the sort of place of secularism when you're thinking about the kind of modern condition, but also the work of interreligious dialogue. I feel like when we've encountering some of our work that there's this idea that non-believers, or the nuns, the NONES, who are not part of this conversation are somehow outside of the interreligious experiments and the interreligious space. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you think about secularism with regards to our work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think secularism has so many types, and just again, we need to have a more nuanced approach to what is secularism. I mean, the secularism that was experienced in Nursi's time in Turkey was a very painful one. So that's why, again, context is really key, because it meant a top-down approach and really forcefully advocating atheism, and that was a very, very, you know, a very traumatic period for Muslims in Turkey then. And I think in America, the type of secularism I experienced very different than the secularism that I experienced in Germany. Here, there's an acknowledgement in the US context that secularism protects the freedom of religion, that everybody, is encouraged, at least has the freedom to express their own faith. And in Germany, I think there is a little bit of a different approach to secularism, where we have this idea that no religion in the secular sphere. And here it's more like everybody, kind of have that freedom and it's protected. Whereas in Germany, we're still fighting for certain rights to practice our religion. And with regards to the nuns, I would say from the studies that I have seen, it's very obvious that the nuns are the people who really want to learn more about religion and spiritual tradition. So really open and eager and curious, but they don't necessarily want to go into institutionalized forms of religion, or, are a bit suspicious of organized religion, which is that they're also fair and valid criticism, right? Because not everything that's happening in religious organizations has really served humanity well. So I think as a chaplain, I saw that young people are very eager and very open to learn about religion and God, and that sometimes institutions fail to cater to their needs, but it doesn't mean that they are not affiliated or not open to exploring their own spirituality. In fact, I experience the opposite.
I'm looking at some questions that are coming in now. I'll do one more follow-up on Syed Nursi, and if you could talk a little bit about why Christian and Jewish scholars are interested in his work and his thought, and if you could sort of speak about his interreligious context.
Yeah, I think he talks about that religious communities have these common challenges, which is there's aggressive atheism. Atheism meaning that there is a kind of forceful promotion of that we need to get rid of God, and God has nothing to contribute, or religions have nothing to contribute to the public sphere, which I personally don't think it's true, because we have, all these extreme loud voices which are not the mainstream. And he encourages, especially the Abrahamic traditions, or the followers of the Abrahamic traditions, to come together and really talk about the common challenges. While we are all trying to deal with, the trivial things, people really wrestle with questions, really fundamentally believe in God, believe in the afterlife, believe in, the revelation, believe in angels. If you look at just these articles of faith, there are a lot of people who struggle with these foundations, and to really ask ourselves, how can we be of service to them? How can we make religion relevant? There are so many resources that our traditions have when it comes to social injustices, but because we are also, just focusing on our own thing, I think we also weaken our own work. So he really encourages the followers of the Abrahamic traditions to come together and really forge these alliances, and to address the larger questions of, the negative sides of globalization, industrialization, aggressive individualism. I mean, a lot of people, we experience now an epidemic of loneliness. I mean, even before the pandemic, young people, people from across the age spectrum, they experience loneliness, and there's a rise in mental health issues. So I think those are the things that need to be talked about collectively, and how we can work together to serve humanity in that regard, and not. I see in my own community, sometimes we lose the sight of priorities. I have a lot of young Muslims in my own circle who really wrestle with foundational beliefs, and to be mindful of that, and to do something together, I think is crucial.
So I'm going to paraphrase a question coming in here, and hopefully the questioner, I'm doing honor to your question. So I think this is a comment about intra-Muslim relations. And so in the US context, you've got Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Salafi Muslims, Sufi Muslim, Ahmadiyya Muslims, all of these different kinds of Muslims from different contexts, as you kind of rightly pointed out earlier. How does that make doing your work in the US, how is that an opportunity and a challenge that there are, I think, all of these different types of Muslim groups? Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so I think already the answer is in the question. It's an opportunity, but also a challenge.
Yes.
I think it's an opportunity. I always, I mean, on the good side, I think it's like a little micro picture of what I call the Meccan experience, that you have all these Muslims from around the world here in the United States. It's huge, like there are Muslims across the globe who live here, and the immigrants who came later like me, but you have then the Black Muslim experience, the African American experience, and each of these experiences are so unique, and they have something to contribute, but sometimes we can caught up in our own bubbles, and I think that's something that I also negatively experienced in Germany, because we have a lot of internal segregation. So I remember once my husband visiting, a German mosque, and on the first floor we had a Bosnian mosque, and on the second floor we had the Arab mosque, and he was like, why don't they pray together? And it's just because of the linguistic factor and the ethnic background that they decided first floor Bosnian Muslims, second floor Arab Muslims. And that really doesn't speak to and really not keeping in mind the younger Muslim audience who live in the US context, who go to the schools, who have American friends or respectively German friends, or deliver the sermon in English, but rather sticking to the kind of ethnic bubble can be sometimes, or their own cultural bubble, I think can be also an obstacle to our common work. So really trying to not lose focus of our, collective goals, and not, seeing these different flavors, as I say, as opportunities rather than obstacles. Still, I think within our Muslim communities, sometimes these different branches or flavors of Islam are still not appreciated, whereas it's, again, a richness. Oh, this is Sufi. No, I'm not going to go to that Sufi mosque. Oh, these are Shia Muslims. They are not real Muslims. That creates unnecessary tension and hinders our collective work. We need to, work together. And sometimes you have, the mosques in the suburbs being disconnected from the inner city mosque, and there is a lot of economic and social disparity and not enough support, where I think sometimes the perception of Muslims is, who live in the suburbs, I need to support my relatives and Muslim community overseas, which is poor, and that's true, but the obligation actually in the religious text is really trying to also focus on the local issues and not lose sight of that sisters and brothers here need our help as well, and that we need to have a dual approach in that regard.
Personal sharing to riff off of this, because I think it's also helpful to think about this in terms of other religious communities, that kind of ethnic enclave bubble. I will share just a brief story about my own mother, who my grandparents were Irish Catholic and Bavarian Catholic. And it was a very large scandal in the early part of the 20th century when they got married. And my mom always tells the story, again, this is the sort of in the upper Midwest, of walking by the Irish Catholic school and the Irish Catholic church to go to the German Catholic school and the German Catholic church, and how there was these sort of broken up by ethnicities, that just, again, with the Catholic community, that was a true picture for the 19th and early 20th century. And now in 2020, it looks very, very different all the way around.
Yeah. And I think we lose sight of that opportunity, especially with immigrant communities. They have what's called in refugee studies or immigration studies, social remittances. So they actually, in my case, for example, when I went back to my tiny Kurdish village, people saw me that I grew up in a secular context in the unbelievers context, but I was even more devout Muslim and than they were. That was their own, their own perception. So they saw, there's something in the West that we can appreciate, that also invited them to reconsider their thoughts and ideas and their perspectives on, the secular or Western world. Because again, once you're exposed to other worldviews and cultures and perspectives, you got to make a choice, right? You are invited to deeper reflection. And so immigrant communities and people who have transnational ties are then able to transform their communities, whom they left. For example, I know a very lovely story in Alexandria where I worked at the seminary. Across the seminary, there's a Jewish temple, and the churches there supported, I think, 31 refugee families from Iraq, Afghanistan. And there was always a group of 20 women who came out of the Jewish temple because they were taking ESL classes there. And I just thought, what a transformative experience, because they've probably never been had this close relationship with Jewish people. And now they're taking English classes, and there were teachers with a Jewish background, and then telling their people back home, you know what, we're having these lessons in the Jewish temple. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there once you're exposed, and how that can be also globally transforming and has an impact.
Another question that I think follows nicely on this one, and then it might be our last one or second to last question. So you've talked about, we know that you've done speaking in churches and synagogues, as well as in university and seminary contexts. What are some of the most common questions that Christians and Jews ask you about with regards to Islam?
Yeah, I mean, what are some of the most common questions? I think because the media narrative can be so strong on that side. Oftentimes the questions about fundamentalism or extremism in Islam, where does that come from? And so even if I deliver a talk about, Islamic spirituality and articles of faith, questions of political nature and, the questions that are constantly asked in the media are raised. And I don't blame, people. Not everybody has, the time to go in-depth study. But I, as a Muslim, I feel the frustration that I can't reclaim my narrative. I always have to follow and perpetuate the narrative, or I need to go into these questions over and over again. And again, no hard feelings, because I understand where people come from. They want these questions to be addressed. But also, I think the Muslims are always forced into the corner and always ask about the same things and the same things. The scarf is really, yes, it is an element in the tradition, but it's not all what there is. And so it becomes so disproportionately talked about that it takes away from many of the very core spiritual and theological elements that are talked in the Quran, about the divine qualities, the attributes, the afterlife, the ethical and moral life here. And politics and extremism is not really, or governance is not talked about really in the Quran. I mean, there's really nothing about that. Something that is left to people. So there are a lot of questions that are related to the political climate in the Muslim world. And again, it's most of the stuff or these issues are not per se related to religion, but because religion is such a powerful discourse, is often, dressed in the religious language. And so it then appears that everything that Muslim extremists or fundamentalists do is always justified by the religion, which is simply not accurate.
I think that is a helpful framing for all of us when we come into this work and into this space, is that we're shaped by the stories that our traditions and the media and the world sort of tells us about religious others. before we even can engage someone in a sort of substantive conversation. And so that's a helpful reminder for everyone engaged in interfaith dialogue and interfaith learning.
I think the unlearning, I think the unlearning process is very challenging, because people come into the room already knowing something about Islam and Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always, the first part is then to try to first, try to unlearn that first, try to put that aside, just listen to that individual, just listen to their narrative and their story, and then, offer your questions. Maybe I think that's, as you said, to be aware of this kind of the possible biases we have.
Right. I love that framing that you're offering us, which is the sort of importance of unlearning as a step in learning, that is something that is often either ignored or deemed to be frightening as part of the process, because it's asking you to change what you think you know when you're engaging someone else on their terms and in their language when they're trying to tell their story. So
yeah. And just to be fair, the same dynamic is also on the Muslim side. I mean,
yeah.
when I go to Turkey and I hear, some of the hurtful comments about people in the West or Christians in the West, or even if you think about the pastor down in Florida who wanted to burn the Quran, people really exploiting that, and in the media, in other Muslim media outlets, where it's as if, all Christians in America are burning the Quran, which is not true, so it's a tiny little group in Florida. Yes, it's terrible, that was, a few years ago, but to take that out of proportion and present the whole Christian world as hostile, or the West as inherently hostile to Muslims, is factually untrue.
Yeah, that is a helpful way to end our conversation. Thank you, and a welcome to Zeyneb. We are so thrilled that you've joined the ICJS community, and we look forward to many years of learning with you.
Thank you, Heather. I'm really excited about our work in the future. And thank you to everyone who joined, and I see a lot of friends, and looking forward to meet everybody in person soon. Thank you.